Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Greetings to you all for the latest CEO and Sector Leaders Forum. We're a forum of CEOs, community housing provider CEOs, and leaders within our sector. And we're here today for our masterclass on place-based initiatives. So I'm Gary Moore, I co-chair the CEO Forum, and I would like to now hand you over to Kate Kearney, who is my co-chair fellow.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou katoa. Hello everyone, I'm Kate Kearney. It's my privilege to be the co-chair of this forum alongside Gary. I also have the privilege to be the co-chair of Community Housing Aotearoa. And for a day job, I'm in Aotearoa, where I run Aotearoa Community Housing Trust. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to Vic, who is our new Chief Executive of Community Housing Aotearoa.
Ngā mihi kia koutou. Thank you all for joining us. I'm certainly looking forward to this masterclass. I have the great privilege of leading us in an opening karakia to open our meeting, and we're going to be using a karakia that our team at Community Housing Aotearoa use at our meetings, whakataka te hau, so please join in with me if you know. For us here in Pōneke, Wellington, it has a lot more meaning today because the karakia talks about the winds from the west and the south ceasing to bring about the promise of a glorious day, and that is certainly what has happened for us today. It is lovely out there. So if you would join me. Whakataka te hau ki te uru. Whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta. Kia mā taratara ki tai. E hiake ana te atakura. He tio. He huka. He hauhu. Tihei mauri ora. Mauri ora e te whānau.
Thanks, Vic. First of all, before we start today, we wish to awhi our Auckland colleagues who, with your level 4 lockdown, the rest of us are empathising with your, it's pretty tough right now. Any of my friends I've spoken to in Auckland seem pretty bored right now. And also a special greeting to our Pacific community. I've been in touch with Rowini on a number of occasions, and I know how difficult it is in your South Auckland community right now. So we're thinking of you all, and don't hesitate to call on any of us, even if it is just to say things are tough. So over to you, Kate.
All right. So look, welcome everyone. I believe we've got about 150 people on this call. And some of you, this might be your first time to the CEO and Sector Leaders Forum. So just to give you the very brief rundown of who we are, we were established about 18 months ago as by CHAR, and to work alongside and in partnership with HUD, Housing and Urban Development. So we've actually been taking a more strategic approach to what we as leaders see are the issues for the sector, and the masterclasses came out of that. We wanted to give our colleagues who work in the CHIP sector opportunities to showcase the fantastic work they're doing. So that's why we're here today. I have a few housekeeping things to remind you of. So first of all, we all need to be on mute, and that's even when we have quite a few presenters on the stage. If we're not talking, we will mute ourselves. There's going to be 5 presenters today. It's really exciting. How we do these workshops is establishing what is the research that can guide us in how we do our mahi. And today we've also brought in an urban planner. Really excited to have Jim here today. And then we have 3 really great examples from across New Zealand of place-based initiatives. So each presenter will be about 10 minutes. After that, we'll all have all the presenters back on the stage, and the wonderful Paul Gilbert will be our quiz master, and he will manage all your questions. So just to let you know how the questions work, on your bottom bar, you'll see that there is a submit question icon. You can send questions in at any time, and Paul will be looking at those. And if you like some of the questions, then tick them, because that prioritises them for us. So we'll talk a bit more about that as we go. But for now, I'd like to start our masterclass today by inviting Suzanne Vallante onto the screen. Suzanne works at Lincoln University, and she has also done some research on behalf of Better Homes, Towns and Cities, and she's going to present that research to us today about what is a really place-based initiative. Kia ora, Suzanne.
Kia ora, Jill, and Kate, and everybody else. Thanks for inviting me along today. I'm going to proceed on the assumption that you can see and hear me just fine, and somebody will let me know if that's not the case. So Amy, next slide, please. Thanks. So when I first started looking at place-based initiatives, probably 15 years ago while I was doing my master's, there wasn't a lot of information really around. And then Patsy Healy started talking about placemaking and planning, and things really started to pick up from that point on. And now we hear place-based initiatives being used to take housing from housing developments to broader community renewal projects. We hear it being used in disaster recovery, and we hear it being used in inner city revitalisation projects. We hear it being talked about in terms of taking public space, which is abstract, and turning public space into public places that people are actually doing things in. So even this morning I was reading about a conservation sort of forestry initiative that was taking a place-based approach. So it really has become a really popular idea. And so it can mean many different things to different people in different places, obviously. I suppose that's the point. So I thought I might just start off by looking at a sort of a brief history of the place-based approach and some of the tensions that I think it resolves. So next slide, please, Amy. So here are a couple of my favourite books. The first one on the left there, Seeing Like a State, by James Scott. So the placemaking and planning, at least as Patsy Healy sort of articulated it, was making the case that context matters. And she was kind of coming from a place where, coming out of the 50s, 60s, 70s, welfare state, quite heavy-handed. And if you think of state housing at that time, it sort of doesn't really matter if you were looking at a state house in Tapanui or Aranui or anywhere in New Zealand. There was sort of, it has a distinctive look, right? There was a kind of a templatic approach. And that didn't happen just in housing, it kind of happened in all sorts of things. So Healy's work was kind of asserting that we need to look at context, we need to look at what's happening in particular places and have local solutions for local problems and local opportunities. And then, of course, in the 80s, we had Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and the sort of neoliberalisation of government. And I guess a lot of those state functions then, like housing provision, were then, sliced off and given to the market. So then you sort of have this tension between a heavy-handed state delivering fairly monochromatic, templatic solutions to a neoliberal state, which is very hands-off and is just sort of leaving places to fend for themselves to some extent. So in the middle of those two tensions, we have place-based initiatives, I think, sometimes being used to, on one hand, say, back off state, this is our place, we need to do it our way. And on the other hand, kind of trying to claw back a bit of support from a slightly emaciated, weakened state when those government functions have been kind of given away. don't move, the places don't move, not as fast as governments seems to change or international capital moves around. So places are kind of stuck in the middle of these tensions to some extent. Next slide, please. But in the middle of all that, I guess the point to take away is with place-based initiatives, places matter and context matters. So it is a challenge to those sort of grand narratives, those templates, those broad brush, statewide initiatives that kind of end up making things the same. It's an assertion that what's happening here matters, what we know about this place matters, how we know about this place really matters. There are different kinds of knowledge and ways of understanding the world, and sometimes they're very formal, very theoretical, and sometimes they're very practical, very applied. So to give you a bit of an example, here's this bus stop. Now the state, as it views things like it, seeing like a state, the state and a passenger will see this bus stop very differently. And this particular bus stop is interesting because it was moved about 50 metres, and it was moved to make way for a cycleway. And we all love cycleways, that's great, but it used to be outside a daycare centre. So parents that couldn't drive or didn't want to drive would be able to take their children, get off the bus, and pretty much be right outside the daycare centre. But it was moved about 50 metres. 50 metres is nothing. It's such a short distance. It's not even worth considering. But in reality, this 50 metres meant that the people getting off the bus with their small children had to walk past a park where often rough sleepers, people were drinking, drug dealers, prostitutes would do their business. And so actually in a qualitative sense, this 50 metres was enormous. So I think that's one of the tensions that place-based initiatives can help us understand, is the different ways of seeing the world and bringing those different ways of seeing the world and understanding the world together. So we're looking at really mechanisms to manage those different ways of knowing. Next slide, please, Amy. So the mechanisms for managing different ways of knowing, they have a long history in housing developments. Some of our most famous ones, Howard's Garden City, Corbusier's Radiant City. And they're famous for their design-led solutions to social problems, but they also really understood the importance of mechanisms for governing places. So, I mean, these two are very extreme, and their differences not just in the design of their cities, but also in the way they thought places should be managed. So for Howard, we're looking at sort of communal ownership and direct democracy, whereas Corbusier was very much, places should be managed by a technical elite who are free from politics. These machines for living will be run by these sort of robotic decision makers who have our best interests at heart in a calculated kind of way. So yeah, these mechanisms to manage difference are really important. They could kind of have their way with some of these ideas because they were often looking at, new developments, whereas in New Zealand, we're kind of, we're also having to deal with retrofitting existing cities and towns. So we're not just starting from a blank slate. We're working with developments that are already there, that already have their patterns and dynamics, their particular patterns and dynamics. Next slide, please, Amy. So these housing developments, our neighbourhoods, they're kind of leaky. They move out. They're not just discrete units that we can target without considering the broader context. And that's another way in which place-based initiatives, I think, differ from some other ways of doing things, and that they're trying to, look at not just the context of a particular initiative, but how it will relate to other systems around it. Next slide, please. So managing that leakiness, there are obviously different ways of doing that, and it was suggested to me that many of the people who would be joining us today would be reasonably familiar with the IAP2, the International Association for Participation. And they, building on the work of people like Sherry Arnstein and Pretty's typology of participation, sort of looking at how you might move from informing people, just giving people information, through consulting them, asking for a bit of feedback, more involving where there might be a bit more deliberation, a bit more conversation, collaborating, working together, through to empowering where a lead agency might just be essentially exercising the will of the people and doing what they want. So I kind of like the IAP too. I think it has some, I'm not sure about empowering. I think enabling is missing from the spectrum, and we need to think really carefully about enabling. But this particular slide that I'm showing you here today is from Place Speak, and they've used the IAP too. And the thing that I really like about this particular slide is that they're not just thinking about the spectrum of participation, they're thinking about the social and political relationships that have to be established to make that kind of participation work. So here you start to see empowering is not at the, I'm dyslexic when it comes to left and right. So at the right end of the spectrum at empowering, the relationship is more equal. And there are relationships between different members of this network. And those relationships are fairly flat. So I think the thing for me that's really important about this in the context of placemaking and place-based initiatives is looking not just at the place, but on the relationships that make places work. So things like social capital, and not just the social capital between families and neighbours, but the relationship between residents and decision makers and residents in particular developments and residents outside those developments. How do they get along? And I'm sure many of you will know from when you undertake your own initiatives, sometimes there's a lot of pushback from people nearby. I mean, we call it NIMBYism, but I'm pretty sure that all of us here today, if something was going to happen next door to us that would reduce our house values, we wouldn't be particularly happy about it. So it's not like we can just dismiss NIMBYism. I think we have to acknowledge that it is, it's something that often accompanies something new and unusual, threatening, and perhaps, unwelcome, but sometimes just a little bit like, oh, I'm not too sure about it. So we have to have those mechanisms, those relationship building exercises to help manage those potential conflicts and tensions. So I'm just going to move on to the next slide, if that's okay, Amy, thanks. So here is a barbecue. And this is an example of something where in perhaps a larger development, you might be considering, should we have a barbecue, or should we have a tennis court, or should we have, I don't know, an electric car charging, communal car charging port or something, And this particular example of the barbecue I put there because I was involved in some conversations about a housing development in the east frame of Christchurch, and I was asked, oh, do you think we should have a barbecue? And I live in Little River. I don't care if they have a barbecue or not. And I don't think the people really running, managing the housing development did so much either. So my question to them was, is there a mechanism through which the people living in this development can decide? I'm not an expert in barbecue provision, right? So are there is there some kind of representative body in place that can help you manage those decisions in that decision-making process? Sometimes having those sorts of decision-making bodies, representative groups, we like the idea of them, but the reality is that if you let people decide what they want, what they want might be a little bit unexpected and unpredictable, and that can make lead agencies a little bit uncomfortable. So when you empower people, you have to expect the unexpected. And while in theory we might welcome that, in reality that can actually be a very uncomfortable position to be in. We actually like to have retain a degree of control over what happens. So there's a really fine balance between enabling people, empowering people, delivering places that people love and they're committed to, without it getting completely out of hand. So I just want to mention a couple of cases where they've managed those tensions, I think, better than many places. So next slide, please, Amy. Looking at a couple of examples in particular, I'll mention Aranui and Vienna at the moment, so two quite different examples. But looking at the work that we did for building better homes, towns and cities, we looked at a range of collaborative initiatives that were sort of very much place-based. And we realised that if you want to have a good outcome, you can't necessarily have a fixed mind. What you have to do is have some principles that help you navigate whether you're on the right track or not. And those principles are obviously up for negotiation as well. But for this particular audience, I think if you are enabling people to take some sort of control or enabling people to help manage the places that they live in, these are some things that you might want to look out for and indeed encourage. So is there some local leadership? Is there a representative group of people, not to engage in an adversarial relationship, but to help articulate the aspirations of people living there? And if there isn't, maybe that's one of the things that you could be trying to facilitate. Is there conflict resolution and some cooperation? I think the idea of consensus is often unrealistic, but cooperation can be achieved even without consensus. Is there some social learning for both the lead agency and locals? Are people becoming more informed? Are they learning? Is there social capital being built, not between different groups and between those groups and decision makers? Collective capability and adaptive capacity and participation in civic life. So to be able to participate in civic life, they actually need opportunities to do so. So that's another thing that we can be providing. Next slide, please, Amy. So I said I'd just mention briefly two sort of cases that mentions in this process, I think, very well, based on the research. Aranui and Vienna, fairly different contexts. And I'd have to say they are kind of the exceptions that almost prove the rule. So although they are sort of held up as good examples, they're held up as good examples because they're kind of rare. So this is very hard to achieve. But what did we see? In Aranui, the establishment of Actus, which was Housing New Zealand went into Aranui in the early 2000s to do some state housing and asking people what they wanted to see. It became apparent that it wasn't just housing that was important to people. There was a lot of other stuff going on. Thank you. In Waitangi Park and the surrounding context as well. So one of the first things that they did was start talking to Christchurch City Council because there was a particularly problematic park bench in Waitangi Park. So they first started with Christchurch City Council and working together. And then they realised that actually there wasn't really a community. And they had to kind of help those individuals living in the same place. But there wasn't really a mechanism to dialogue with Housing New Zealand Council. So they helped mobilise the community and helped coming into being. So Actis is still around today, and they sort of proved their value post-quake when they really were able to advocate for the community. So I'm probably not going to talk too much about Vienna, but I will just mention that, as I said, Aranui kind of was an exception that proved the rule. In Vienna, this idea of place-based initiatives is sort of embedded more in their governance, cultural disposition, and it's a way of life. So I think if we're looking at ways to sort of exemplars to examine best practice, Vienna and Aranui are not bad places to start. In Vienna, if right from the beginning, potential tenants, future tenants are involved in decision making. They fund quite generously. If they know something's going to be controversial, they will generously fund collectives that might oppose that initiative, and they set up forums for debate and discourse. So if anything's going to be problematic, they get in early, they get in quickly while things are still fluid and soft, and you know, bring the conflict to the table, but also the solutions. And this is just a way of life and embedded in their governance process. So I'm kind of out of time, but I'm definitely willing to share some resources and material that I've collected about these case studies and a number of others as well. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. I'd like to now introduce Jim Lundy, a Glaswegian-trained urban designer, architect and planner. Jim's probably most famous work was designing the lane strategy of Melbourne, but Jim's worked as an academic, as a practitioner of planning and urban design. And welcome, Jim, over to you.
Kia ora, Gary. Well, I was asked to give a talk about town planning in relation to how we create neighbourhoods or communities. And I'd start off by saying when I did my degree, it was called Town and Country Planning. And you had to sign up to an oath, which is planning is about the greater good for the greatest number. And it was about creating great neighbourhoods for people to live in. That was how it started off, in health issues: clean water, clean sewage, parks, open space, so that the rich could continue to get richer and the poor horses could actually be fed and watered better. So, why this is, I'll start the slide. Oh, there it goes now. But there are some bigger issues at stake now in our world and in our environment. We are reaching a tipping point environmentally, socially, economically, and culturally, a tipping point. And we have very little time to change direction, make the walker go in the right way. So urban design and town planning should be about creating sustainable and ecologically sustainable cities and neighbourhoods where the ecological footprint actually is matched by the output of local generated energy, food production, and recycling. So planning is not about a set of rules. Planning should be about creating great community. It should be about creating master plan communities, creating communities around public transport, waste minimisation, creating a sense of place, creating a sense of self-reliance, reliance on energy, and on food reliance and food security. And it's about social and economical and ecological capital restoration. So at the moment, when we talk about sustainability, we're really just fiddling around the fringes. And that's not going to turn the oil tanker around. Yes, it's nice to put stormwater in here, but the stormwater still ends up in the river. It doesn't get to the fundamentals of what creating community is. So town planning really is about what kind of city do we want? And I'm talking about we, because at the end of the day, town planning is about people. It's about the people that you're planning with, not the people that you plan to. So are we going to continue to develop a city of have and have-nots, or are we going to deal with the housing crisis? Are we going to allow our cities to erupt into chaos as people are excluded from education and wealth just because of their race, gender, or social economic position in society? Norman Foster said the modern age has in most cases failed with the rebuilding of our old cities that were destroyed in the war. And modern architecture has shown itself completely incapable of recreating the complex grain of places which took centuries to evolve. So clearly, modern architectural vocabulary isn't up to the job. So urban design and town planning isn't architecture. Architecture is part of the toolkit to create community. We actually know what works, but we don't build it. We look at these two images. They're the same physical area. One is the center of Paris, and the other one definitely isn't. Traditional urban villages are where my family grew up. This is the Gallowgate, where my siblings and my parents grew up. My grandparents lived. They all lived in what we called one tenement building, a close. So the family all lived in these single-end apartments, 6 kids to 1 room, outside toilets, outside wash houses, but they had public transport, they had local shops, they had local industry. People walked everywhere or got the tram into the city to enjoy the museums. That's how my parents grew up. My siblings grew up walking to the dance hall, walking to the cinemas. The people, the powers that be, decided to do to our community what they wouldn't do to themselves. They destroyed it to get rid of the slums. And this is what they replaced it with, which have now become modern slums. In fact, that's the sort of area that I grew up in, as opposed to my siblings. You know, Billy Connolly called it a desert with windows. There was absolutely no local facilities built with the housing. Nothing wrong with the housing. Forget the aesthetics, but internal bathrooms, 3 bedrooms, good quality housing. 1 lift. You imagine when the lift breaks down, going up all these stairs with your pram and your shopping. So what we need now, again, is nothing less than a revolution. In Paris, they have really started to embrace the 15-minute village. They had a good head start on us anyway, because they do live in 15-minute villages. They can get to the shops, they can get to parks, they can go to theatres, go to the arts, have a coffee, go to a wine bar, do exercise, all within 15 minutes of where they live. That is the aim of Paris. Paris is considering over the next 10 years closing their whole city centre to cars, A, to increase the quality of living in these areas, B, to reduce the stress on the environment. We all know what places, the places that we love when we travel, and when we live in areas, places like New Regent Street and Christchurch, people love. It's not actually about the architecture, it's about the scale, the uses and the vibrancies of the area. This area is a jumble of buildings with modern, old, it has cafes, it has tourist facilities, it has a chapel, and it has apartments and hotels in it, all within a very, very small public space and public square. Planning has become too simplistic with a very simple toolkit, which is called the district plan, with rules which actually don't work and don't create good community. You know, it's the planning and urban design is not a one-note song. It's a multi-note song. And urban designers, planners should be like the orchestra conductor. But we keep building places like this. This happens to be a slide from America, but we are building suburbia, which is no different from this in many ways throughout our country. This is a one-note song. This is not a community. This is not sustainable. This is not at a density that is either giving public amenity nor enough density to stimulate mixed use. So what creates town planning? It isn't a set of rules. When you look at all the theorists, urban design and town planning is about sustainability, it's about visual quality, it's about the morphology and the patterns of the town and the landscape, it's the spatial quality of spaces, it's how you perceive these spaces. Are they safe or are they unsafe? Am I welcome here or unwelcome? It's about creating a social equity and social justice, and it's about responding to the immediate context and the function of place. So what does that look like in planning? And I don't know if you can see the cursor, but that looks, this is modern planning, frantic chaos with roads and roundabouts everywhere. This is planning where you have a series of neighbourhoods that are interconnected and connected by a public transport system. The top one with the frantic road system creates separation of uses, housing, industry, commerce, and retail. The traditional village or town has all these uses mixed up in the one area, all within walking and cycling distance of each other. So town planning and urban design has to be about sustainability. We have all the building blocks of creating great community. We know it theoretically, we know it practically, but we don't have district plans that are making it happen. We know what places we like to hang out. We like our cafes, we like places in the sun. We do not need cars in many of the spaces we go to. The lanes in Melbourne used to be just places where trucks delivered goods, and now they're the most famous place. They've actually created the whole image of Melbourne. Again, it attracts people, it attracts footfall. We actually in Australasia built before the car. We built before the car in places like Ponsonby and places like Mount Eden, places like St Albans and the inner city here in Richmond. And this is actually Paddington, totally carless today because the lanes and streets are too narrow to get cars down and there's no parking. It doesn't stop people living there, doesn't people stop paying a fortune to be in that area. And we know that streets actually should be about people, and they shouldn't be just about cars and infrastructure transportation. But we lack the courage to change. This is what Hallswell Green should have looked like, and it actually is being built like Suburbia again. We could have had a riverfront full of apartments. Instead, we have a riverfront with two-note song, hospitality and offices. It's not a multi-note song. And we could have had a glorious square that reflects our Indigenous culture as well as the environment, as well as the post-colonial culture within it, and translates it into something else. But we found out in New Zealand so far in planning, bold is a four-letter word. So we need to transform planning. We need nothing less than a revolution. We need to stop acting like the overlords, the gatekeepers, and start to work with the people that live in these environments and understand them. We have to stop using the old adage and change it. When the rich gather to look after the future of the poor, it's called charity. When the poor gather to look after the fortunes of the rich, it's called revolution. I say that planning today in New Zealand deserves and needs a revolution if we are to solve the environmental, housing, social and economic issues that are confronting our cities and our regions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. That was great. And I'm sure people will come back to that. I'd now like to introduce Jill Hawkey, who's the Executive Director of the Christchurch Methodist Mission. Jill is also co-chair of the Te Waiponamu Network and is a trusted voice in Christchurch for the poor. So Jill, kia ora and welcome.
Thank you, Gary, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this workshop today. I'm going to start by giving a brief overview of the Christchurch Methodist Mission, then give some background to the Guild Street community as an example of a place-based initiative. I'll then finish by outlining some of the challenges we're facing along the way. Next slide, please. The Christchurch Methodist Mission is a social service organisation as well as a community housing provider that works across the Upper South Island. We've got a wide range of services from the cradle to the grave, including a preschool, social services, and a for older people. But the fastest area of growth in the last 5 years has been in housing. Next slide, please. Since the 1980s, affordable housing in a village environment for older people. But when I started at the mission 7 years ago, I asked the social workers what was the biggest issue impacting on their clients' lives. And they said to us, housing. So that spurred us on to become a registered community housing provider in 2015. And we now own approximately 90 houses, primarily for families or whānau and for older people. We also lease some homes in the private sector or Aotearoa for transitional housing and for housing first. But what I want to share with you today is our Guild Street community in Christchurch, which is home to 15 families. Next slide, please. Guild Street's the second housing community we've developed using the relocatable houses that were built for people having their earthquake repairs done. The first was a small development of 5 houses on leased land from a local parish called Waitangi, which opened in 2016. Next slide, please. Shortly after this, we agreed to purchase a further 15. So the search for land began. It wasn't an easy journey, but 2 years later, our board chairperson, Pam Sharp, thought of the old Churchill Courts rest home site where she had previously worked as a nurse. So we talked with Angela here, and after some good negotiations, we signed a lease for 34 years. Next slide. It's an amazing site. It's 15,000 square metres, but with streams on both sides, it had performed badly during the earthquakes and wasn't suitable for subdividing and selling. However, following geotechnical reports, we were advised that there's a strip of land up the middle of the section where it was possible to place these light relocatable houses. The fun then began. We talked as a team about at what stage we consult with the local neighbours and had decided to wait until it was granted. However, a local workman on site told a neighbour about the development. The neighbour went to the council and all hell broke loose on social media. The concerns were varied. The houses were out of keeping with the character of the local neighbourhood. One neighbour referred to them, and still does, as shit boxes. Who would these people be who were going to be their neighbours? Would it include gangs? Would it have extra traffic and so on? So we called a public meeting to address, and it was probably the longest 90 minutes of my life. The neighbours were angry. Consultation. In fairness to them, they had been through a lot. It was an area hard hit by the earthquakes, and they had had 10 years of roadworks, demolitions, and so on. We were just another group to them. So following a special hearing at the City Council, which heard the concerns of neighbours, we agreed to make some changes and the resource consent was granted. So through this difficult process, we also built a relationship with the Richmond Residents Association, who turned out to be brilliant. The project manager and I attended their monthly meetings throughout the build process, and over time, much more positive relationships developed with the neighbours. Next slide, please. It took 6 months from the time that the land was blessed and the first house moved until opening day last December. Next slide. Over the family started moving in to the two-bedroom units, and 2 4-bedroom units. As of 56 people living on site, including 33 children. representing 7 different ethnicities: Māori, Māori, Pākehā, Samoan, Tongan, Fijian, Afghani, and Iranian. But the Methodist mission is about building communities, not just houses. And our experience with our other family complexes is that it's really hard to build a strong sense of community without an actual physical space to do so. In our other complexes, we'd had barbecues and bouncy castles and so on, but usually these happened in the driveway and are always reliant on good weather. Next slide, please. So this time we bought a 16th 3-bedroom relocatable house for use as a community house. And thanks to philanthropic funding, we've employed a community development worker for 5 years. We did a lot of thinking together with the Wayne Francis Charitable Trust about an intentional community-led development approach. We talked with prospective tenants about this model before they moved in, so they could make the choice whether this was a community they wanted to be part of. We were fortunate to find Renee, an experienced community development worker who is gently building relationships with whānau, helping them to identify their hopes for their own whānau and for the wider community. Renee has created lots of opportunities for people to come together. Next slide, please. Waitangi Day, Samoa's Independence Day, Matariki. Another afternoon, the children gathered to talk about what kind of play equipment to have in the playground. Next slide, please. Parents now come to the community house to ask Renee for help with benefit applications, to help sort out other issues, and so on. And then connect with nature is also important for the Methodist mission, and the large park-like setting is perfect for this. Renee worked with Tamariki in the last school holidays to build vegetable plots for the whole community to use. There's lots of space for kids to ride their bikes, play games together. It's an amazing natural environment for children to grow up in. Next slide, please. Renee's also working hard to build relationships with the wider neighbourhood. Immediate neighbours, a considerable amount has been spent on additional planting to protect their privacy. Well, the first few weeks were a bit rocky. We have now gone a couple of months with no complaints from neighbours and no call-outs from the police. So that's progress. So 9 months on, what have we learned and what's working well? And that's the question I put to Renee. Next slide, please. Was cross-cultural diversity. He reports that residents are developing cross-cultural sensitivity, understanding, and curiosity, while children are learning from each other and hurdle into cultural stereotypes without realising it. Building community amongst the adults has involved learning and relearning and more careful and calculated actions. For example, before coming into a neighbour's house, residents are asking what's acceptable in the other's culture. Second, there's a real sense of safety and security. One resident says that she's safe, that she knows her neighbours, at least everyone's face, so that she feels safe for herself and her children. Third, sharing support, resources and support. Residents have people to go to for issues, problems, complaints and other needs. They've supported each other in both emergency and day-to-day situations. Short-term childcare, grocery shopping, watching over each other's houses if they're away, carpooling, toy sharing, information on food banks and other resources. Fourth, the children are learning from each other. One classic is they're reminding each other not to swear. Not a big issue, but they're having fun and doing things without technological gadgets and just being kids. And Renee's last point, sense of ownership or territory and a pride of place. Sometimes this includes questioning and reporting incidents that some residents feel are not right, behaviour that they don't want in their community, but it also extends to gardening the communal areas and tidying surroundings other than their own backyard. Of course, there are challenges. The wider Neighbours will always be a work in progress. Next slide, please. Within the community, while friendships are created, familiarity and proximity can also breed contempt. More often, the complaint is on the next door neighbour: music, domestic quarrels, parking, rubbish, childcare practices, child's behaviour, substance use. While they're all normal complaints in all other neighbourhoods, there's a heightened expectation amongst some residents that these issues should not be part of this special community. Participation can be a challenge, with some communities being part of everything, while others not wanting to engage. But that's also normal for any community-led development initiative. We're playing a long game, and relationships take time. And even though the community house is fabulous, staff say it would have been better to have a purpose-built space with a larger dining area and kitchen for special events. We're really conscious that this is a resource-intensive model. Development worker for 15 families. Realistically, you could have one worker for 30 or 40 households in a larger community. Next slide, please. I want to finish by saying that this has been a real joint effort. Anglican Care, who were prepared to lease us the land. 2 trusts who gave donations towards the community house, as this is something that the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development can't contribute towards. The Wayne Francis Charitable Trust, who fund Renee and a research project that runs alongside his work. The Local Residents Association and local Methodist parishes who came and did a final clean through so that the houses were ready for the new residents. Next slide, please. But most importantly, it's now the tenants, with support from Renee, who are developing Guild Street into a thriving community. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That was fantastic. I'd now like to introduce Nigel Bickle, who's the Chief Executive of Hastings District Council, and they work closely with MHUD and their local iwi to develop a place-based solution in Hastings. And kia ora, Nigel. Welcome to our masterclass.
Hastings has a thriving economy, diverse community, fertile plains, and stunning climate. However, like the rest of New Zealand, we have a housing crisis. In 5 years, emergency housing needs rose 600%. Our region had 2,000 people living in motels, unable to find homes as rent and house prices rose. We needed new ideas and new ways of working, leveraging available resources to find solutions fast to implement, but still providing quality homes. We needed strong partnerships with people who really care. Mana whenua, Council, the Crown, funders and community support groups at the coalface supporting people who face constant uncertainty about where they would sleep.
Together we had to address housing our homeless, upgrading existing housing to make it healthier, getting families out of emergency accommodation, housing our seasonal workers, long-term social housing for families and seniors, and helping first home buyers. All this without negatively impacting our world-famous fertile growing soils. In the past 12 months, we have 3 new papakāinga developments, 3 mixed model housing developments limited to people who will live in the homes. A major housing project is underway with more in the planning stages. Dedicated seasonal worker accommodation, taking pressure off our rental market. Changed planning rules, encouraging higher density in inner city housing. Crown funding for an accelerated social housing program, and most significantly, 534 building consents were issued in 2020. That's up 46% on 2019. Our plan, accepted by government as a New Zealand pilot, is building homes for our people now.
Kia ora, talofa lava. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks very much for the opportunity of talking with you today about the place-based approach that we've been taking in Hastings. I hope the video played all right for you, but in essence, the housing crisis in Hastings became manifest in 2018, as was being experienced and seen in the rising number of whānau living in motels as emergency housing, rising house prices, rising rental prices, and a lack of land available for housing development. So the context for our place-based approach came when we were fortunate enough to have the Prime Minister and some of her ministers captive at a local marae in April 2019. And we chose to have a conversation over 3 hours that was just about housing. And in essence, it was a simple proposition, which was the housing market's not working for everybody here. We've got increasing numbers of people that aren't able to participate in the housing market. We know it's a priority for government, but we think that whilst we had a pretty good handle on what was going on and some good ideas, the proposition was pretty simple. If we actually led this from place in a true partnership between the Crown, iwi and community, including local government, we thought we could come up with a plan that would take many years, but that would actually address getting to a functional housing market for everybody. So in December 2019, the government, following some work that we did, agreed to take a pilot approach in Hastings around a place-based approach. And we're 2 years into that journey now, and what I wanted to do was just share a few of the insights from our journey to date. So I guess I'll start by acknowledging that what really resonated with me in terms of Suzanne's point is that place and context matters, and that was a fundamental starting point for us, and the importance of actually understanding place and what's going on in your place in the housing market, so you're making sure that you're treating the causes and not the symptoms. So the things that we learned from an initial 8-week period of working together between iwi, Crown and government was that, yeah, it was really easy to default to there's not enough public housing in Hastings, and that was true. Aotearoa or Housing New Zealand before them had only built a net 6 houses in the previous 3 years. But we also had some major problems that council needed to own, that we'd basically not had enough land provision for supply. And that was a major constraint. And that one of the things that, whilst it's not unique to Hastings, it's not a problem right across every housing market. We had to house 5,000 temporary workers from the Pacific every 12 months who worked on our orchards. So we learned some quite interesting things through the first 8 weeks. One of the killer questions that we had was, why in an economy that's growing strongly with a growing population do we have 1,000 less rental homes than we had 3 years prior? And no surprise, we learned, well, when 2/3 of your motels have been taken out of the visitor accommodation market to house families and to house seasonal workers, we probably shouldn't be surprised that 1,000 homes that once were rentals have been turned into Airbnbs. So I guess my first point is that it's not about paralysis by analysis, but doing enough work that you actually understand your place and that you have a plan that in our context was about the housing continuum from homelessness right through to market housing, so that you could have confidence that the plan that you were undertaking short, medium and long term was actually going to address the causes and not the symptoms. The second of my 3 points is the importance of building relationships with partners. So a fundamental starting point for us is that nobody can do this on their own, that the Crown plays a pretty significant role, but if you believe in place and community and the role of iwi, then it is about building a coalition of the willing and an alliance of critical partners. So in our context, that has been iwi. It has been half a dozen government agencies. It has been about the council through civic leadership playing a strong role in leading this out for place. And it's been underpinned our work by a set of principles, led by a vision that we've all bought into, that housing is an inalienable human right and that everyone should have access to safe, dry, warm homes. That we take a long-term view to our work whilst being very focused on short-term delivery. That houses are critical, but houses build communities, and that it's whānau and community that's at the centre of our decision making. And in our context, where 30% of our population is Māori and 75% of the housing population in emergency housing is Māori, that iwi and Māori-led housing solutions is a key principle to the approach that we take to work. So over the last 2 years, what does that look like on the ground? Well, it's a governance team that meets every month. Myself as the chief executive, the chair of the iwi, Andrew Crisp initially, Brad Ward is the Deputy CEO of MHUD, our government and community partners, and that's underpinned by the same agencies at an operational level meeting every month. So it's been about building really strong partnerships across a common vision and a very clear delivery plan. There's probably online, but I want to acknowledge also the importance of critical friends. So Brian Donnelly, we've been very blessed to have as part of our place-based approach for the last 2 years, and he plays that role really, really well as our conscience and critical friend in terms of asking all of the really tough sort of questions of us as partners to this approach. And my third and final point is about delivery. And just a relentless focus on the plan. So, ultimately, I've been involved over a course of a public service career where sometimes we're really good at producing vision statements and strategies, but ultimately it's all about delivery. And, we've at a governance and operational level, governance is about first and foremost supporting us to be successful, but holding each other to account. And we've just been relentless around the delivery plan. So to give you a sense, in the last 2 years, we've had 100 public houses built, 200 are under construction today, and around 400 are in the planning stages. We've had $10 million invested in Papakainga housing that's been delivered. We've got 4 affordable housing developments underway on council land. We've got 120 home kaupapa Māori village being built, and we've invested $1 million through our district health board in terms of a healthy homes initiative that's had 40 existing homes upgraded for our Māori households. And we importantly have now forward land supply with over 1,500 sections coming to market over the next 24 months. So I'll finish by acknowledging that, we've had the joys of being the pilot with government, and the government commitment has been critical because of the role that they play in housing. So the fact that we've had commitments to build 200 homes in the first 2 years of the plan, another 400 in the 3 years after that, a $30 million co-investment with council on affordable land development, $4 million into our local tai whenua for this kaupapa Māori housing village. I can't underestimate that a lot of this wouldn't have happened if we didn't have that level of commitment and financial commitment from the Crown. But I suppose when I look forward, where I'm really excited about some of the recent announcements around the $4 billion infrastructure, accelerated housing and Māori housing fund. So that's kind of our story to date. When I look out over the period of time in front of us, it's this, but some other things that we're exploring. What does a place-based housing entity operating in the affordable and sub-rental housing market look like? How do we make sure that our local settings, if givens for us are basically the big challenge that we see now is the lack of affordable housing development and product like progressive home ownership. What do some of the settings, whether it's inclusionary zoning or other things that we can do at place, look like to enable that to happen? But I guess in finishing, place-based for us has been off being really clear about our place and what we're trying to achieve, building critical partnerships and alliances, and being relentless on delivering the homes that our community needs.
Much for sharing that example. Really great. Just before we bring Neil in, can I just remind people that you have the opportunity to ask questions? So if you go to the bottom of your screen, there's a submit question button. If you send those in, we'll be bringing all our presenters back on to the main stage for probably the last 15 minutes. So Neil, fantastic to have you here. Neil's the GM of Tamaki Housing. Welcome.
Kia ora, koutou, ko Neil Porteous tōku ingoa. I'm just going to take you through a very brief presentation because I know we want to have time for questions about the Tamaki Regeneration Project. Next slide, please. So we're a Schedule 4A company under the Public Finance Act, and we took over 2,700 properties from what was then Housing New Zealand on the 1st of April 2016 under one of the transfers. And the long-term plan is to turn those 2,700 houses into 10,500 new warm, dry houses across Tamaki. And we're also, because we're a regeneration program, we're also focusing on 4 key areas, which are the housing resources, the social transformation. So we're working really hard to change some of the systems that result in inequities in our community, economic development, and placemaking. And underpinning this is a real focus on the communities. We have a real drive for manumatuhaki, which is in the community taking real ownership of the transformation of their place. The photo that's there is a protest, quite a significant protest that took place in GI, which is one of the areas of Tamaki, and that was just under 4 years ago. Historically, there was a real a lot of whānau were moved out of Tamaki when the houses were required for redevelopment, and this caused a lot of distrust and trauma within the community. And we've spent the time since we took over the assets trying to rebuild that trust. And it's great to see. I was just reflecting on this. A number of the people in that photo are now members of the community who we work really, really closely with to drive for the outcomes we want to. Next slide. So there's a photo of Tamaki. It's for those of you who don't know Auckland, it's about 12 kilometres from the CBD. It's 4 kilometres north to south and 2 kilometres east to west. Has about 20,000 residents, 11,000 state housing tenants, and 60% of the houses in Tamaki are state houses managed by us. It's quite a young population, 35% under 25, and the community experiences significant social and economic equity. 80% of our state housing tenants are Aotearoa Pacific, predominantly Pacific people, and that's why we have such a strong drive to address some of those inequities. Over the period of the regeneration, we're expecting that the population to grow from the current 20,000 to 56,000 over the next 20-year period. So there's significant change going on in the community. Next slide, please. So the highlights to date. So of the 10,500 houses we'd like to build, we've built, as of last month, 818 new houses. We've got about another 600 under construction at the moment, and another 1,000 or so on the pipeline. So the pace is really, really ramping up. We have a big focus on progressive home ownership, and we work closely with the New Zealand Housing Foundation in that area to awhi our community into houses, and we're unashamedly focusing on our Māori and Pacific whānau to move into those affordable houses. Historically, a lot of whānau have had to move out of Tamaki because of the previous model of moving whānau out when their houses need redevelopment. And the other big thing that's happened is the house prices, because of what's happening in the New Zealand housing market, and particularly Auckland, has priced a lot of those whānau out of the market. So we work really, really hard to support them into housing. We're just working with a number of small local NGOs to build some transitional houses on vacant land. And we also have a big focus on transition, on jobs and skills hub. So over the next few months, we'll be hitting 1,000 placements through a job and skills hub, where we work in partnership with the Auckland Chamber of Commerce, and the education strategy. So there are 10 local primary schools, 1 secondary school, and we're working on strategies with them to improve the educational outcomes for our community. So this is a slide I really wanted to focus on. It's about the community. So one of the great things about being a place-based organisation is that we basically know the community because it's in a very defined geographical area. And I talked a lot about building trust before. One of the areas that we really is core to the way we operate is our tamaki commitment, that those who wish to stay in tamaki will have the opportunity to do so. So for every house that we require for redevelopment, we have an absolute undertaking that the whānau living in that house, the state housing tenants, will be able to stay in tamaki. We start working with the whānau 12 months before we require their house. We speak to them about their social networks, where their kids go to school, how many people are living in the property, where they go to church, where they work, and we work really, really hard to find a suitable property for them within tamaki. We've rehoused 300 whānau like that over the last 5 years, and we absolutely always uphold the tamaki commitment. And it doesn't come without its challenges, as you'd all appreciate. We often find there's additional whānau living in houses that we have to work with. There's additional families. There's whānau living in the houses who may not be eligible for state houses, and over time we build up a high level of trust so we can work with those whānau to support them. The other big area is that over time we've next slide, Amy. Yeah. Over time we've worked really hard to develop authentic community representation, and I'm the first to admit we haven't always got it right. We've always had a community liaison committee, which is 12 community members who are basically nominated by the community, and then the community body that body. We've had that for the last 5 years, and that meets every 2 months. We talk to them about the various initiatives are underway. We update them. We get feedback, and it's similar with the tenant voice group. So the tenant voice group meets monthly about issues that are raised by tenants. We have community representation on our board. Our board is selected by our stakeholders, which is the government and the Auckland Council, but we have 2 community representatives on as observers, and they're full attendees at the board meetings. They get full access to all the to the board packs, and they're very, very active participants. The other big thing that we've done is that we hire from the community. So we have just over 100 people in the organisation now. On the front line in the tenancy management space, we have about 45 people working in that space across community engagement, affordable housing, tenancy management, maintenance. About 40% of them actually live in the community now, and about 60 to 65% of them have very, very strong connections into the community. And whenever we hire new people, our first port of call is always to hire locally first, and we accept that will often mean that we need to put in really strong support for our colleagues who join the organisation. But what it means is that when we're out in the community, working with the community, our community see they see the kids they went to school with, they used to babysit with. They see their neighbours when they're talking to us, and that's just been so massive in building the trust. We also speak the main languages. of the community, of the 6 main languages. And finally, I just wanted to talk about that last one of our operating principles. We travel at the speed of trust. One of the things that's really important to acknowledge in place-based organisations is the need to travel at the speed of trust. You need to take the community with you on the journey, and that's often really, really hard to do because it takes lots of support. It takes a lot of you need to not think about the way you might have done things in previous roles or previous organisations, and accept that we're here for the community and travel at their pace, the speed of trust. So thank you, and look forward to the questions.
Aha. Thank you, Amy, for unmuting me. Thanks, Neil. That was amazing. Great work you've done in Tāmaki. Right, we're now going to have our Q&A session, and we've extended the session just by 15 minutes. We hope you can stay on because our presenters have been so fantastic. We've had lots to get through. One other thing I'd just like to mention is that we're really aware that the examples we have today, while we're talking about housing for Māori and for iwi and partnerships, we had also really hoped to bring a Māori-led development along today. And just want to acknowledge James Tapuni of Ngāti Toa, who was to be here today but couldn't make it. We'll work with Te Matapihi to see what we can do on another date. Handing over to you, Paul.
Kia ora koutou. I'm just going to move over to Matilda. We've got a question from the floor from one of the attendees. It's addressed to you, Nigel, in the first instance. Matilda was really quite inspired by the kōrero around the relationships and collaboration between the different parties, NGOs, local and central government agencies, and has asked you to please expand a little bit on the areas that you felt worked really well that others of us could do part of, or things that you could do more of more often, and perhaps that could move to other parts of the country. So what are the aspects of that have gone really well for you? Yeah, so probably contextual to our place, where we feel pretty lucky, is have an absolutely outstanding mayor who is a really active civic leader who is passionate about social equity issues and has made it the one of the council's biggest priorities to ensure that homes for our people, is an outcome that's been delivered for our community. We have Ngāhi Waitangi, our iwi chair, the longest standing iwi chair in New Zealand. So we've got a lot of the recipe for making it work in place. So we've got strong leadership, we've got deep relationships, and we've got a pretty good track record of collaboration. So I'll just state that up front because that's been key to it. And then one of the things, and I'll sort of acknowledge and a shout out to Andrew Crisp, and I'll disclose he's a mate from a long time working with him in Wellington. But I think one of the other critical things that's made place-based working in our context is Andrew's really backed up the idea that this is led from place, enabled by Wellington, and not the other way around. And that's been absolutely key. And I think creating an environment in place where we've created a mandate, so it helps having the pilot where we often say to ourselves, oh God, we don't need permission from Wellington to do that. Let's just get on and make magic sort of happen. So it really has been that combination of strong leaders, a commitment to collaboration. We've learned some things along the way, so it's a lot of this gets to, I think, the behaviours around placemaking as it relates to partnership and collaboration, where you've got to be prepared to let some things go. Your starting mindset has to be one of things will go wrong, but let's accept that it will be a cock-up and not a conspiracy. And our mindset is one of generous disposition and actually valuing relationships, because it's really easy to have a dump on government. You feel better, but it doesn't advance anything. So that's been some of the keys from our perspective. Fantastic, thank you. There's also a supplementary question which I'll pass on to one of the others after you've answered it first, please. And it really relates to what are the one or two things that would really, you could call them barriers or opportunities, but what are the things, the presence of which are not there now, that might really help you paddle your waka faster and further?
Yeah, so the really exciting thing that we're working on at the moment that for me is critical around placemaking for the long run is, so, and this is no commentary from a political perspective on colours of government, but you recognise that in a critical part of the housing market, which is public social housing, the Crown plays a huge role. So in our context, whilst we have a growing couple of community housing providers, 90% plus of the supply of, social and public housing is the Crown. And we're really nervous that, like it has been in the past, at some point, it won't be a priority of the government. And that things that we saw a few years ago, we could see again in the future. So we think one of the critical opportunities that we have going forward is to look at the role of place and being a place-based entity, not to compete with government or other providers, but what could a place-based entity look like in time where place has more control and aren't relying on the government. So we're looking at things like between 3 councils in Hawke's Bay that have 800 homes worth $70 million. If we were prepared to partner with iwi and create a place-based entity of scale, could we, with government, get ourselves to a space where, over the long run, we are more sustainable and at scale to play an ongoing place-based role than being reliant with whoever the government of the day is. So that's something that we'd love to have in place for the future that we don't quite have at the moment.
Yeah, a lovely sort of self-determination aspect to that. I'm going to break with the sort of sequence because, as you might have noticed as you've listened to this, we've gone from the large to the small. Jill, can I ask you a similar question in the sense of what are the things that the presence of which would make a significant difference to you at this point in time as you're looking to expand your reach and your context with your communities and to be a bigger influence on positive community enhancing outcomes and housing in your area?
Is actually obtaining land and actually being able to build, because as we said before, we feel we've got a model that works well. It would be really great to be able to expand it. We just want to get building more houses because at the end of the day, that's going to be the thing that makes a difference. We're trying to buy land at the moment in Marlborough and Blenheim for social housing. It's just incredibly expensive and very, very difficult to buy. So yeah, that's our biggest challenge.
Okay, Neil, can I pass to you? I know you're a hybrid there because you're half Auckland Council, half the state, but you still got a thriving and diverse community with Glen Innes, Panmure, etc., Point England. What are the big challenges for you as you try to build an inclusive, diverse and thriving community in the context of your place?
I think it's about taking the community with us, and as I said, we're basically doubling the size of the community, and we're very aware that if you've lived in GI for multiple generations, and there's a massive influx of people who from other areas of Auckland that can have a big impact on the way that the community feel about living there. And that's why we're so focused on the affordable housing area and attracting Māori and Pacific whānau to move into the area and for those who've moved out historically to move back, and providing with the educational and the work opportunities to do that. It's a whole, it's not just about building houses, it's about everything that goes with it and building communities.
I don't want to put you on the spot, but we're hearing quite widespread reports from chief executives across the Auckland area that the basic economics are a real struggle with land prices as they are. what other mechanisms do you see are available to us in the bag of options to try and make sure that we're building affordability into what we're doing in communities like that? So as you say, so people who have those existing connections in the community can stay where they are, and you can honour that promise.
Yeah, it's not really my area, Paul, but I know that the team are working really hard in innovative ways, and given that we are 59% owned by the Crown, I know there's a lot of discussion around coming up with ways to address that. I think one of the other key things that we're very focused on for every whānau we move out of a state house into an affordable house, it frees up a state house, and that's just a really big focus for us.
It's a great mechanism for allowing people to stay in their community.
Yeah.
Vic, on this topic, if I could bring you in just briefly, because I know you've been working on this idea of supporting people to stay in their own communities in a place-based way through this concept of inclusionary zoning. Could you just speak to that briefly?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay? I had to do the old double click of the mute button there. Yes, so we briefly appeared before the Select Committee on the Natural and Built Environment Bill. Our Deputy C, Chris, and I, gosh, I think it was last week, but time is a bit mashed up at the moment, so I'm going to say last week. And we're really clear that this could be and should be a key aspect of the current RM reforms going underway. So I think I really hark back to, I think it was you that said it, Nigel, treat the cause, not the symptom. And I think we really see that land value and supply of land is very much a cause, and that inclusionary zoning is an enabling tool that can support the treatment of that cause. We've seen some success with the limited way in which it's been applied in Queenstown, and QLDC actually has a consultation out at the moment on how they might be able to effectively beef up their inclusionary zoning principles that they have. And I think the biggest comment I would make in the context of place-based is that whilst inclusionary zoning probably should have some mechanism in the legislation, the ways in which it can be applied can be highly contextual, because it does come back to how the local government can work in partnership with other actors, as Nigel so excellently demonstrated in Hastings. So it has a really strong ability to really support this place-based approach, because it is about what each specific community and market needs.
Fantastic, thank you. Just before I hand back to the co-chairs, I wonder, Suzanne, if you've got any final... Oh, she dropped out. Nope, she's dropped out, so that's okay. I'm going to hand back to you shortly just to close the meeting, but thanks, Vic, for those comments. I think we're all grappling with competing issues in this space, and I think one of the unique characteristics that the community housing sector brings is its diversity and its agility in terms of local place-based responses. So it's really awesome to hear these examples of solutions and continuing to bring solutions to the table for the problems and the nearest edge of this mighty problem that we see before us, because that's the best we can all expect to do. So I think in the absence of any further questions, which we have...
Can I just make one comment? If that's
please
okay?
do. Please do.
I think when I look at the local government landscape, if I use an example, so these 4 affordable land developments that our council's doing on council-owned land in Flaxmere, I mean, 10 years ago, we couldn't give land away in Flaxmere. And ironically, it's the ridiculous stuff that's going on in the housing market now. Houses are selling for 700,000-800,000 out there. The key for us to doing this affordable land development in Flaxmere was the private sector weren't going to do it. The council was never going to take the risk with the financing tools available to us that if we built it, we could recover the costs through development contributions. So, the Crown de-risking that for us, then we've moved into this space. And of course, the things that you can do as a land developer as council. So the exciting things, the things that give me joy in my job this year, is having 220 sections coming, where we're not doing this for any profit margin for the ratepayer. We're doing it at bare cost. So we're selling fully serviced sections for $130,000, which is as cheap as chips in Hawke's Bay, with covenants that you can't be a company, You can't be an investor. You have to be an individual first home buyer. You have to live in the home for 5 years. And if you sell that home, you're going to have to pay 12% back to the council. But of course, for the council, one of the questions in front of them now is, okay, we're going to bank $20 million out of these, albeit we're doing it at affordable housing. So how do we start to think as a council about our ongoing role in the affordable, land space? So I suppose the message out of all of this, I think that there's something, I look at neighbouring councils who have a lot more land than us that are making a bloody fortune at selling it at $400,000 or $500,000 for a section. I just think I think there's a real question for, local government to ask themselves about the role that they're playing in this space as well. Fantastic.
Thank you. Any final reflections before we move back to Kate and I think Vic, you were going to close.
I guess my comment to your last observation, Nigel, was Gandhi said there's enough in this world for every person's need, but not every person's greed. And I think that what we are witnessing in New Zealand is the incredible driver of housing as a place of greed. And I know that sounds terribly old-fashioned, but New Zealand got place-based housing right in the 1950s and 1960s, and that's when some of us grew up. You can tell by the colour of my hair. But we actually have to fight for that again. And place-based means the place where a kid can grow up in a family where they've got the local school, the local sports clubs, the local library, the local support structure, the doctor, it's just essential. And so today we've seen a range of options from the observation from an academic perspective, urban design perspective, and then examples of what's happening within our sector. We have to raise our game as a sector, and this is a step towards it. And so all of those that have done a huge amount of work in this, we greet you and say, well done. Over to you, Kate.
Wonderful. I just want to say thank you to you all, to all our presenters, how amazing you were. And to Char for bringing us all together on this platform. And to those who have sort of watched us and been listening, we really hope that you'll enjoy the presentation, which you will receive. It's been recorded, and presentations will also come out to you. So again, thanks everyone for an amazing afternoon. It's been really great. Vic, if we could ask you to close with karakia, please.
Absolutely. I have a reflection before we have our karakia whakamutunga, our closing karakia, and that I know for me, I'm going to take forward, thank you to Neil, the need to travel at the speed of trust. I think it's very easy to get impatient because we know things need to change, but working with our communities in a really deep and meaningful way, I think is to travel at the speed of trust. So for me personally, that's the reflection I'd like to close us off with before officially closing us off with a karakia. Kua mutu a mātou mahi, mō tēnei wā. Manaaki tia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, aio ki te Aotearoa. Ngā mihi kia koutou and have a wonderful afternoon.